welcome to today's session. Thank you for inviting me to speak on it. My background, just very quickly, is I'm just transitioning out of the corporate world, actually, and so I've just spent the last 9 years looking after people capability at Standard Chartered Bank for all of our client businesses, and various roles over the last 9 years. That's the sum total of my financial experience. To open my own practice, I recently moved, and my own practice will be looking after, looking at things like learning strategy, learning design, leadership development, and the such like, and executive coaching. The last 9 years, I suppose, culminated in looking at future skills, and nothing reminded me more of that. Natalie, you were talking about sort of change. I recently transitioned moved from Singapore. I was based in Singapore until July this year. Moved back to the UK and landed in Wales. And my younger daughter, who's a graduate, was helping me to unpack. And she came across something in the boxes and picked it up and looked at it. And it was an old Microsoft save disk. She said, "Dad, you're so clever. You 3D printed the save icon." Which is sort of one of those things about when I was brought up at work. I mean, it was only 2002 that actually those were everyday currency, and the speed of change is something that we kind of all reflect on. I know many of you on this call will have spent the last 2 years trying to desperately catch up with the pandemic. I know in my company, over the last 2 years, when I was with Standard Chartered, we went from 80% of people working in an office to 90% of people working from home in the space of 6 weeks over 72 countries. And that meant, even like 55,000 of those people didn't even have the basic equipment to be able to log on. So dramatic change. And as we reflect on that, what I'd also like to put into the pot is that the speed of change will never be this slow ever again. It's getting faster. And the overall trends of change mean that we have to start thinking about the skills that people are going to need to be able to deliver what they need for these organizations moving forward. And that's really what today's session is all about. It's kind of one of those, the robots are coming moments, right? And when we get those robots are coming moments, you can face that with a certain amount of fear. And there will be people in your organizations, I'm sure, which do face this level of, rapid and dramatic automation, particularly across the financial services industry, with a great deal of fear, because they've done manual or processing type jobs for a really long time. There'll be others, particularly the digital natives, but not only the digital natives, who will be facing it with a huge amount of enthusiasm. But wherever you sit on that spectrum, it is one of those things that we probably all need to be front and center of our mindsets. And I know that in a recent survey of chief executives, reskilling and preparing organizations for the future was actually the #1 requirement for CEOs, specifically across financial services. So, and of course, this bit about the robots coming, there's a lot of school of thoughts around it, and like, will it displace loads of jobs and will it make us all more lean? I mean, in actual fact, where these technology revolutions have happened in the past is typically you end up with a workforce that's just got different skills, not less or more. Well, sometimes actually quite a lot more. So there are more people employed because of technology. It's just that the job profiles shifts fairly dramatically, and financial services, I feel, is in the throes of that change kind of right now. And it might be the early throes of it, but we can expect a quite dramatic shift in how humans will need to augment the workforce with robots and blend with robots to be able to deliver services for our clients in the future. But the way that I wanted to sort of frame this dialogue was around future capabilities required in financial services. Forgive this moment of cheese, by the way. I found out it was the worldwide premiere of the new Bond movie today. So do apologize for the moment of cheese. But I do think that it is this ability, for I understand most of the people on this call are learning and development professionals. This is a fantastic opportunity for learning and development and HR to really step up and be entirely relevant to the front line, because preparing for the future and having these strategic conversations, not something typically that the front line is very used to. I really do think it's a license to find new budgets and build new initiatives that can really be at the heart of the business moving forward. So I'm going to just share a little bit of research before we get into the conversation and get your questions and views and what have you. Many of you may have seen this already. So this is the World Economic Forum research from their report that came out in 2020. It's the most recent report that came out from them. It sets the frame, and this is cross-industry. So it's not just financial services, but financial services do figure to about just under 20% of the respondents across the industry. And this particular survey looks at the future of jobs. It says, and published last year, it says that by 2025, automation will have reached a level that we will have literally 50% of the workforce will be robots, in effect. Automation will have got that good. And of course, that is going to create turbulence around the type of roles that we're going to see across financial services. And obviously this is available on the World Economic Forum research. I've done a little screen print of it there, which I'm sure is far too small, but you can see, sort of some of the things that you would expect to see in increasing demand, like data analysts and big data specialists and AI people, increasing demand. The decreasing demand is going to be those things which are pure processing roles, which can be automated far more rapidly and easily than some of the higher level functions. But this is going to create quite a bit of turbulence across financial services as well, and I hope is already playing a part in many of your strategic workforce plans as we speak. And then we've then got a number of skills that this is going to increase. Now, interestingly, World Economic Forum noted that the skills that would be required moving forward were things like technology and digital, but most importantly, they were the more human skills. So learning, analytical thinking, innovation, critical thinking, problem solving, and creativity become the more human skills that are actually likely to be required far more in the future. And so it's an interesting call because as Natalie said, I think a little earlier about the enthusiasm that there is for digital and data projects, actually some of the skills that are required conversely are not so in, maybe a knowledge of that, but not so much, more in the human space. I thought it might be interesting to share a little bit of work that I said is not verbatim from Standard Chartered, but it was context from Standard Chartered and a few of the other banks that I've now spoken to since leaving Standard Chartered around an approach for building future skills. Because this is an easy thing to say, let's go out and build future skills, but kind of like, how do we first of all get people in our organization, particularly at a leadership level, to start buying into that when they're driven on a quarter by quarter results? And actually it's quite difficult to build enthusiasm for 2025 when it's so slippery underfoot right now and we're trying to perform right now to meet this year's budget. So how do we get people enthused around this idea of future skills? And how do we build organizational wide engagement on that? I guess the second thing is, like, specifically, what does that look like? Because we've got this World Economic Forum research, which is interesting, but not very specific. And unspecific doesn't really get the attention of the leaders. And then there's a little bit around the how. So how do we start to build, kind of like our talent strategy and capability strategy for the future? Should that be build or buy? And then if it's the build, how do we build those skills? What's the best way of doing that? So I'm just going to share a little bit of work that I did within a previous organization. Apologies. This was a kind of message that seems to be true across the banking industry. It's like, who is driving that change? And I guess the important fact there is, like, it's clients driving that change. So client habits are changing pretty rapidly, whether you work in the retail sector, where we all want, sort of online banking everywhere, accessible at any time, or in the corporate space, where we're getting into the 24-hour treasury, the demand for a 24-hour treasury organization. It is clients that are driving the change that banks and other financial services organizations are going to have to respond to pretty quickly. And that's sort of underpinned by these 4 massive global trends around the industry and economic shifts. For example, shift of, or the renaturalization, I guess, of global domestic GDP from west to east, in terms of the balance of power there. And the rise of new industries, particularly in the healthcare and e-commerce sectors. I mean, society and environment, we're at the challenge of our lifetime with climate change, and financial services will need to play a role within that. Society demands it, as does, in my view, of course, the future of people-kind. Technology we've already alluded to, but the technology advances that we're seeing at the moment are phenomenal. And the big 4 in terms of open banking and APIs, AI and data capabilities, blockchain. And I think that the unsung hero, particularly in banking, around this sort of idea of cloud, which enables so much of these technologies to take root and become more cost effective. These are advancing at a speed unparalleled by the past. And then we also know that our workforce is changing very, very dramatically. In the established markets across the West and the East, we have, sort of largely aging workforces, which are going to produce its own challenge. And we're all on the hunt for new digital natives, but actually everybody's hunting for a diminishing pool. And so the idea of reskilling, particularly when it comes to mid-careerers, is going to become way more important. And then we've got the rising youth populations coming out of Africa, where a large portion of the world's youth are now based. And all of this is creating changes and skills required. Now, so a taxonomy for this, I'm just going to share with you, this is not a word for word, because I don't think I'm able to share word for word, but a taxonomy for this might look like these sort of 6 main buckets in terms of digital banking, which we've talked about earlier. But interestingly, many of these are not just technicals. There are some technology related skills. Some of them are sort of more traditional technical skills, but shifting to traditional technical skills. And many of them are actually quite human. So I've kind of tried to bucket those in this area of, digital banking, data. And then you've got the sort of more traditional skills of risk management, but risk management with a different flavor, because cyber, I think, was polled to be the banking CEO's #1 risk that kept them awake at night. And I'm sure that environmental is raising very, very quickly up the curve for that, meaning that our products and markets are going to become far more far more sophisticated in terms of what our sales and product people need to know about sustainable finance, the emerging industry types, and just being able to do higher level advisory than they've ever done before. And then, of course, we'll talk about human skills, which might involve use of methodologies such as agile and human-centered design, but also leadership, interpersonal skills, emotional intelligence, and cognitive become super important to people. So I just wanted to get a flavor for how people were viewing all of that. And John, I wonder if we could just sort of launch, there's a poll that I just wanted to understand what this audience are thinking about their top 3 future skills across the business. So there's a poll that's launched. Please answer it. Well, just for anyone who's just dialing in, let me just read out the results very, very quickly. So we've got, data, 50% of the audience thought data in the top 3, followed very closely by digital, 46%. Emotional intelligence, very reassuring to see, at just under 45%. Client engagement, 39%. I mean, I think this is an interesting one around client engagement. And I'd like to bring in Natalie and Justin to just sort of talk around some of the results for here in a minute. But client engagement for me feels like a really important one. And in Standard Chartered, one of our Future Skills Academy, interestingly, was client advisory. Now, I can't tell you how hard I had to fight at Standard Chartered to get that past HR. But when I mentioned it to bankers, they're like, yeah, of course, that's exactly what the future skill is. Because, look, our salespeople, back in the 90s were selling a trade. In the 2000s, they were selling our platform to be able to trade. They now have to understand far more sophisticated way the various different algorithms that are needed to be able to trade that. And that requires a huge amount of advisory type skills to be able to position that, as well as just knowing more or less what the algos are. Let me just see if some of that's playing through to you, first of all, Justin. What's your view on these top 3 skills?
No, absolutely. Thanks a lot. I think probably 2 stands out for me in terms of the results. Maybe the first one, which is the fintech awareness. I think about 20% of the people went with that. I know the whole ecosystem of fintech, which changes the profile of how, on an individual level, people interact with all the online payments and the banking system, etc. And that, I think, has a trend of converting on a mass scale, how on an industry and a corporate level, how sort of money flows around the economy. So I think it's interesting. A lot of the presentations that some of my analysts did recently was indeed around, I think you mentioned just now, Paul, about the younger generation in Africa. I sort of sat in on a couple of good presentations recently where they were presenting on the role of and the importance of fintech on developing the African economy. And I think it's one of those spaces that are certainly developing. And I think from a future skills perspective, it's probably been underrated at the moment in terms of the impact it will have at some point in the future. So I think the result of that one is probably one that stands out for me. And then the second one maybe would be on the sustainable finance piece, which again, I think there's a lot of trend towards that and understanding the whole scope of ESG and sustainability and how that impacts both on the buy side and the sell side. And I think certainly from a skilling perspective, there is a level of a way to go in terms of understanding exactly what's required and what value could be added from a finance professional perspective in that particular area. So I would say those are the 2 that sort of stands out, notwithstanding the traditional skills where there's just 10% says it's relevant for the future. So that's great to know.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more about sustainable finance. I think this is a massive opportunity for financial services, and it means that they have to be really on the money with both the products and the principles of sustainable finance. Natalie, how about you?
It's interesting because this is about top 3 future skills. If I look at it from the schools that I work with, the number of students taking business analytics, big data master's programs, at least in this side of the world, has exploded. So in terms of that, the schools, because they have to, of course, upskill and they have to catch the trends and train up people for the future, this is where it's at. And in asking them even this year, I said, there are so many schools, even just in Hong Kong, they're producing hundreds, each of them are producing hundreds of graduates. Do they all get jobs? And the answer is yes. And actually, I coach a lot of them, and some of them actually, I'm not sure if I would hire them, but they're all getting jobs, okay? So it's not even the future, it's actually now, and everyone's hiring for now for the future. Emotional intelligence is where I specialize in. And it's interesting because I also sit on the committee for one of the small liberal arts colleges in Hong Kong. And there was another iBanker, I won't name which one, which bank, who's actually involved as well. And he was telling me when he found out what I do, that the graduates that he works with, a lot of them are really good with technical skills. So this is going back to client engagement. So if you ask them anything technical, they can spout out things ad nauseum because they hire top graduates as well. But once you ask them to sit down and write down their analyses or thoughts or whatever on paper, they're at a loss. So it's not even if you already even get to emotional intelligence, even their ability to critical thinking, to enunciate, to write down their thoughts in a coherent manner, as opposed to just specific technical skills, is actually lacking right now. Okay, and then if we take that a step further, going into in terms of emotional intelligence, in terms of how they're able to manage their emotions and so on and so forth, that's also a big issue with a lot of the schools that we see at the moment. So I'm talking about schools, but also from the company perspective, this is also what's coming down the pipeline. I mean, when you're talking about client engagement, as you said, we need the technical skills, but in order to engage the client, you need people skills. You need to understand where the client is coming from. You need to analyze their business. Plus, you need to understand the personalities of the people you're talking to. And you also need to factor in, like, if you're going to talk about human-centered design, you need to understand humans. And so if people don't have the emotional intelligence, they don't understand how humans tick, they're not reaching out to people, they're not engaging, then how on earth can you have client engagement? So I literally have a client from last week that we spoke to who tasked me with this. They don't know how to engage with their clients. Can you please design a program around this?
So what I'm going to do, I thought it might be interesting just to generate a little bit of conversation. We'll do this really, really quickly, though. Let's just take a typical job role within a bank. So we'll call this person Poonam. She is a relationship manager covering for an international bank. She covers corporate clients in the oil and gas sector. How will the skills she needs need to shift for what she needs to do to be successful in the next 3 years, and what sort of proficiency level might she need? So I just wanted to kind of put that out there and generate a little bit of chat in the chat function, rather than people shouting out, just around what's going to be different, what will she need to develop, what's going to stay the same, because I noted that whilst it was a small number of people, 10% of you felt that there would be no change. Traditional skills are also future skills. They will still be required. So what will be different, what will stay the same, what level of proficiency will be needed, to what degree, moving forward. And there's just a few comments on chat just to get some different perspectives on there. So I'm just going to, again, just talk to Justin and Natalie while people either type a few things in there, and we'll capture a few points from those.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe just to add, as part of the research for this presentation, looking back at some of the articles presenting in the FT with respect to investment banking skills, and there was one dated back in 2013. The headline read, "Jobless bankers left behind by changing demand skills," and that was back in 2013. And this was in the fallout of the 2008-2009 sort of crisis, where you had a lot of unemployed sort of investment bankers at the time, and sort of the key aspect there was on transferable skills. So even then, the communication, the way in which you speak with clients, the way in which you develop your personal rapport was seen as one of the things that's required as key skills at that point in time. And then fast forward to 2019, same again in the Financial Times. One of the headlines coming out there was that wanted finance grads with AI and programming skills. And so if you sort of had a crystal ball and lenses that you could look forward to see what the headline is likely to be in 6 years' time. So in 2025, maybe it's going to be finance grads wanted potentially to help keep up with the AI. And then by the time we get to 2030, it's going to be the finance grads who can help bring lunch for the AI, right? So it's really important to recognize the sort of pace of change and how even within the last 6 to 10 years or so, how things have evolved. And I think it resonates well to what we're sort of speaking about here, which is the interpersonal skills becomes quite important to understand.
Yeah, Natalie, any views from you?
I mean, when we're looking at digitalization and we're looking at AI and we're looking at all this stuff, and you won't need to upskill, you need to see what the computers can't replace. And so obviously that's the interpersonal skills. What's worrying for me, because I'm also a mother, and actually this year is particularly concerning for me. I've seen changes over the years. I talk to the schools, I talk to my clients, we do a lot of fresh grad training, and there are changes year on year, but this year it seems to have accelerated in a not so good way. So I'm getting requests for really basic communications training, which I never would have imagined. So I have one client who told me they now have fresh grads who they can't even ask it's not answering a coherent, it's not answering a question coherently. They cannot even ask a coherent question. So the questions they ask when they do ask one, because a lot of them keep quiet nowadays, people don't even understand what their point is. And when you try and ask them a clarifying question, they're not clear on it themselves. And the problem is they don't even understand that they're not clear. So this is actually very concerning to me, both as as a parent on top of everything else. I also have a fresh grad working for me. So there's that part, right? It's also another part is there's one thing as a trainer. So there are schools that I've been teaching for over 10 years. I go back year on year. And there's one of the topics that I teach is interview skills. I wrote a book on it as well. And there are these two schools that are actually very close by. They're the top schools in this particular location. One school has a reputation for being more shy, and they're not so aggressively self-promotional. The other one is really good at communication skills. So every time I go to these two schools and I do this certain exercise where I ask for volunteer to be the volunteer in front of all their classmates. One school hardly ever has any volunteers. The other school, people are fighting for the chance. This year is the first time ever where the school that always has the students who speak up, no one volunteered. And when I asked the person in charge, of these students, I said, what happened? Is it because of COVID? Is it they're just used to Zoom and they're hiding behind? Because that's what a lot of people say. And she said, no, actually, it's this generation, right? This generation, there's something about how they were brought up that they just don't want to step out, right? Whether it's their comfort zone, they're shy, they don't want to communicate. And a lot of them, what I see commonly across is they just feel that they can hide behind the screen, and it's easier now because it's COVID, and they feel they can get away with not communicating, not relating with people. So not only was this a problem originally because this was not because of COVID, but it's now compounding because of COVID, because they're not even joining the workforce on a face-to-face basis.
I mean, thanks, Natalie and Justin. I'm just going to comment a couple of minutes. So, Stephen, I really love your comment in the chat. I think that this feels inherently right to me. If you think about an email is a inherently complicated thing that nobody really knows what it is. I had to set up my email recently for my new business, and had to sort out matching the DNS from the domain name to the TXT across Microsoft Exchange. I mean, I had no idea these things existed because I used to have an IT department that sorted that out. I don't think that people need to know the ins and outs of technology in order to operate it, but they need to know enough about it to operate it effectively, and project managing is pretty important. Heba, I love the comment about digital awareness and mastery of digital services. And I think that, this idea of emotional intelligence resonates really strongly with what Natalie was saying. Digital proficiency, I think, Paul, that sounds pretty important to me as well. When I was with Stan Chart, maybe this was something to do with that particular bank, but a lot of leadership hid behind the point of saying, oh, can someone come and do this for me? I'm a bit of a Luddite. That's not an excuse anymore. Like, this is how we do business. So the digital natives can do it, but we must expect other people to do it, because otherwise we're going to slow the whole system down. And And then managing and anticipating change. Christian, I absolutely get that. Being able to take a step back and having the headspace from processing tasks to understand what's new and coming. Communication skills, Diane, so we're getting a lot of endorsement for that, and critical thinking and people skills. Thank you. I'm sure there's a lot more views to come. I'm going to just move on very quickly so we can move on to other questions very quickly. So wherever you are on your journey for upskilling your teams, there's some factors that you may want to think. I mean, these were factors that I found it helpful to think about when I was building the journey for Standard Chartered, and it's sort of related to a why, what, and how. So why are we thinking about reskilling? What is the business case for that? What is the payback for that? And I think you can look at this from a defensive perspective or an offensive perspective, which I mean in use of the words attack rather than being offensive to people, obviously. So defensive, what I mean by that is, look, you know, as a result of automation and digitization, we are going to have displaced workforces. There will be some risk in that. If we can rehire those people, that not only creates a hard saving for people, which equates probably to about 100,000 USD per person per hire, as best I could work it out in terms of unit costing in a previous life. And also there is reputational risk and regulatory risk to save with the point of reskilling people. So we can look at it from a defensive point of view. My preference is to look at it from a more offensive perspective. If organizations, banks, financial services organizations can put reskilling on the agenda early, then they can start to own this space in terms of moving to a more, you know, sort of augmented workforce, digital AI and human in the future. And I think there is a lot to be gained by that, by being, you know, first mover advantage. And what that requires is, because we don't have, we cannot possibly as L&D professionals personalize the learning experience for every single person in our organizations. It requires a whole culture change around being able to take ownership of my personal development on an enterprise-wide basis. Which is why I think the leadership buy-in is so dramatically important. Then there's the what capabilities are we talking about? What does the data say in terms of strategic workforce plan, and how do we build and define a talent strategy, build, buy, borrow, whatever. And then of course, there's the how. So, you know, is this a blended learning solution? Who are the priority populations, and how do we focus on the skills that are required in order to build those in terms of both general proficiency, so base fluency, I would call that, or deep expertise, and who needs to know that. Just a few words before we go into other questions. Look, there are some capabilities that AMT have across that, aside from their traditional training capabilities. They have capabilities to help with consulting for the what and the why, for helping to design that learning, and also a number of programs from both human and a technology skill perspective, which I'm flashing on the screen for you now just to give you a sample. But I just want to jump back to slide 7 as the sort of closing remarks. I'd sort of plan to do another poll here, but in the interests of making sure the agenda is, well, we will do that very quickly and just say, look, you know, where are you on your journey for this right now? So this is great to see that many people have started already. Some people are not in that. Very few have a full strategy in place. Fantastic to see that most people have started, however. And if you haven't, clearly there's an offer of help there for anyone who wants it. And also for anyone wherever you are on the journey. John, I'm going to come back to you so we can go through some questions.